my co-counsel, Mr. Spencer Richardson.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
We represent the defendant, Miss Drew Mars.
There was some pre-trial matters from the plaintiff.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, we'd like to invoke Rule 603 and 615, which constructively swears in and sequesters all witnesses, barring party representatives. In this case, our party representative will be the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers.
All right, that's granted.
And second, we'd just like to note for Your Honor's attention that pursuant to the stipulations, exhibits 1 through 7 have been pre-admitted.
Okay.
And with that, Your Honor, we're ready for opening statements.
Defense, any pre-trial matters?
Just one, Your Honor. For the sake of Rule 615, we would like to make the court aware of the fact that the defense does have a party representative in today's case, and that is Miss Drew Mars.
Understood.
And with that, the defense is ready.
Okay. Opening statements whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. It's August 14th, 2018. A woman named Agatha Lee is getting ready for bed when suddenly she feels a pain in her chest that won't go away. It becomes harder for her to breathe, and within moments, she's dead. She died of a heart attack. Members of the jury, this is Miss Agatha Lee. She was a writer. She was also a grandmother who loved and cared for her family. Unfortunately, members of the jury, she's no longer here with us. All we have left of her are pictures, memories, stories to tell about her, just like this one. Today, you're going to learn that the reason why she's not here is because on August 14th, the defendant, Drew Mars, murdered her. Today, you're going to meet Drew Mars. Drew Mars was the caretaker of Miss Agatha Lee. And what you're going to learn today is that the defendant, Drew Mars, was set to inherit millions of dollars from Miss Agatha Lee. But on August of 2018, something changed. Miss Agatha Lee decided to change her mind and put her grandson back on that will and take out the defendant. You're going to hear that when the defendant found out that he would no longer be on that will, the defendant laid a trap. The defendant poisoned her, members of the jury. But you see, the only reason we know that is because although the defendant laid a trap, he also left a trail. Now, I want to take a moment to explain the law in this case. This case is not a criminal trial. We're not trying to send anybody to jail. This case is about money, about who is set to inherit the will left by Miss Lee. And the rule governing today's case is called the Slayer Statute. And what this rule says is that if somebody was found to have caused the death of a person and they were on that will, they would get nothing. And that's exactly what we're going to show you today. Now, today you're going to hear a lot of dates, a lot of names. So I just want to take a moment to make the timeline clear for the members of the jury. Mr. Parts, if we could please get a timeline up on the screen. Now, the story of today's case starts here in July of 2018. That's when Stevie Rogers, the plaintiff, the grandson of Miss Lee, decided to pay his grandmother a visit. And for over the next few weeks, Stevie Rogers and his grandmother grow closer and closer. So much so that on August 14th, his grandmother decides to put her grandson back on her will and take out the defendant. You're going to hear that same day, she called her attorney to set up an appointment for later that week. And when the defendant found out, the defendant laid a trap. You see, you're going to hear that same day, later that evening, the defendant goes to a pharmacy that sells chloroandramine pills. You're going to hear today that the reason Miss Lee had a heart attack was because of chloroandramine pills that she had consumed the next day. You're going to hear that after the defendant goes to that pharmacy, he goes back to the victim's room that same day. And within a day of the defendant going to the pharmacy and going inside the victim's room, she was found dead. The cause of death was a fatal allergic reaction to 2 chloroandramine pills. She never got to see her attorney later that same week. And now, members of the jury, today's case is very simple. All we're going to ask you to do is to look at how the defendant laid a trap. And we're going to ask you to do that by following the trail. A trail that goes from the pharmacy to the victim's room, and from the victim's room to the defendant. Because you're going to hear that later that same month, the police searched the defendant's room, and inside her closet, they found a bottle filled with chloroandramine pills with the defendant's fingerprints on the bag. The defendant laid a trap. Which is why at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Jonathan Parks, will come before you. And he's going to ask you to find the defendants liable for the death of Miss Lee. Thank you.
Thank you. Defense, opening statement.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
This is Drew Mars. You're going to hear today that Miss Mars spent over a decade as a caretaker. That she spent most of her adult life providing support for her family and providing comfort for Agatha Lee. Now, make no mistake, members of the jury, Miss Mars is not a killer. Now, you see, opposing counsel just got up here and they told you that today's case is simple, that it's about some trails and a trap. But what they didn't tell you, what they don't want you to know, is that the reason we are in court today is because the author, Agatha Lee, wanted to write the ending of her own story. You see, opposing counsel might try to point the finger at Drew Mars all day today. But the truth is, another tragedy has occurred. You see, Agatha Lee didn't die at the hands of Miss Mars, but rather, tragically, she took her own life on August 14th. She wrote the ending of her own story. Now, you're going to hear about 2 different Agatha Lees during trial today. The first was friendly, warm, passionate about her work. But she was also a very private woman who only let certain individuals come into her personal circle. But above all else, you'll hear that Miss Lee was a very proud woman who cherished her independence. And for over 80 years, this is the Miss Lee that her friends and her family loved. But you'll hear today that during the summer of 2018, something changed. Miss Lee was quiet, introverted, and she was dealing with the health problems that accompany old age. You'll hear today that her only living relative, Stevie Rogers, had just moved back into her life. And during this time, Miss Lee found out that the only reason the plaintiff had come back was for financial support. Now, through it all, Miss Lee maintained that independence and she maintained that pride. And so rather than let her health decline and let her mood continue to sour, you'll hear that she wrote the ending of her own story. I want you to pay close attention to this second Agatha Lee throughout trial today, because you're going to hear witness after witness tell you about how Miss Lee's mood and health were rapidly declining during that summer. Now, the plaintiff has the burden of proof in today's case. They have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not, that Drew Mars purposely or knowingly killed Agatha Lee. But as you listen to today's trial, it'll become clear that opposing counsel simply can't meet this burden. Now, we as the defense, we don't have a burden in today's case. We don't have to call any witnesses or provide any evidence, but we will. Today, you're going to hear from two witnesses who will explain why Agatha Lee might want to write the end of her own story. First, you're going to hear from Drew Mars herself. Miss Mars is going to tell you all about her decades-long relationship with Miss Lee as her caretaker. But Miss Mars is also going to tell you how she saw Miss Lee's health decline during that summer, and along with it, her mood. I want you to pay close attention to Miss Mars's observations on the date of August 14th, Miss Lee's last day, and how Miss Mars tells you that Miss Lee was acting unusual, different. Next, you're going to hear from the biographer, Ryan Cabrera. Mr. Cabrera was compiling a profile on Agatha Lee when she passed. And relying on over 6 months of interviews, Mr. Cabrera is going to walk you through the change that he saw in Agatha's behavior over the course of those 6 months. I want you to pay close attention when Mr. Cabrera explains why their last interview on August 14th was ominous, given what would happen just hours later. Now, members of the jury, there's no contention today that a tragedy's occurred. And when we're finished, no one really wins. You see, the plaintiff has lost a family member, and Miss Mars has lost a close friend of 10 years. But I anticipate both of those individuals would tell you that they would trade all of that inheritance, all of the estate, for more time with Agatha Lee. Members of the jury, we simply cannot compound this tragedy by holding an innocent person liable for something they didn't do. And that's why at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Mason Baruki, will come back before you one last time, remind you of the evidence that you've heard, explain why Miss Lee wrote the ending of her own story, and ask that you find Miss Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Before we begin, before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I ask that everyone switch to the gallery view on the upper right of your screen so that we can see everybody there. Attorneys, please remember to, I will remember to mute if you're not going, of course, but I want to make sure we can get everybody there. So first witness for the plaintiff, whenever you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. To begin our case in chief, the plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers to the stand. May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Stevie Rogers.
Could you tell us why you're here?
2 years ago, my grandma was killed, and her caretaker, Drew Mars, she got everything in her will, everything she owned. I'm suing Miss Mars because I believe she was the one who killed my grandma.
Let's back up for a moment, Mr. Rogers. Who was your grandmother?
Agatha Lee. She was a writer. She wrote mystery novels.
Is this her?
Mr.
Mr.
Garcia,
Parks?
I actually don't have that available right now.
Sure. Mr. Rogers, were you and Miss Lee close?
When I was young, we were. My parents weren't really around much, so she took care of me.
You said when you were young. Did something change?
In high school, my parents died. She asked them to run to the store. It was a drunk driver. I thought it was her fault. We didn't talk for a long time after that.
How long didn't you talk to her?
Long, until 2018.
Well, what changed that year?
It was the 10-year anniversary. 10 years since they died. I guess I was just tired of not having a family.
So what'd you do?
I got her address, went to her house. I remember walking up to the door for the first time. I thought, I guess I didn't know what she would do.
What happened when you arrived to Miss Lee's house?
She said I was home, and I stayed.
Sir, I want to talk about your time with Miss Lee. Did anybody else live with her?
Yes, sir. There were 3 of us, my grandma, me, and Drew Mars, her caretaker.
Did you know who Drew Mars was before you got there?
Yes, sir. Grandma told me that when we lost touch, she had put Drew in her will.
Would you recognize that will if I showed it to you?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Parks, do you have the will here with us?
I do, sir.
Mr. Parks, could we put Exhibit 9 on the screen?
Yes, Mr. Garcia. Just give me 1 second.
Mr. Rogers, is this that will?
Yes, sir. It looks like it.
Does it look fair and accurate?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, at this time, we move Exhibit 9 into evidence.
Any objections?
Without objection, Your Honor.
So answered.
Mr. Rogers, did Miss Agatha Lee ever talk to you and the defendant about her will?
Yes, sir. She did.
When?
It was the morning before she died on August 14th.
Can you tell us about that conversation?
Sure. We were in her study talking, and I saw Drew outside with her ear sort of against the door. It looked like she was listening.
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge.
Response?
Your Honor, I'm not asking this witness to speculate or to testify to anything this witness doesn't know. He told us that he saw Drew Mars with her ear on the door, and he told us that it's his opinion that she was listening. It's a rational-based perception under Rule 701. We're allowed to do that.
Response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. I believe the plaintiff has said that they were seated and they're testifying that Miss Mars had her ear up against the door. And I'm just not sure how they would have been able to see that if the door was shut and they would have had their ear up against the door. My objection was also not to speculation. It was a lack of personal knowledge. I'm not asking to go into any mindset of Drew Mars or anything like that, Your Honor.
Response?
Yes.
This witness told us that this witness saw the defendant with her ear on the wall. That's all the foundation that we need to lay to prove that this witness had knowledge as to what was occurring. He told us that he saw her.
Yeah, I think we can explore that on cross-examination overall.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, Mr. Rogers, what did Miss Lee tell you and the defendant?
Well, she said she was going to talk to her lawyer and write a new will, but this time with my name on it, not Drew's.
After Miss Lee announced that she was taking Drew Mars out of her will, did you see how the defendant reacted?
Yes, sir. Drew looked to be frowning a little bit. Her face got kind of red, and then she told me that there was no way she was going to let that happen.
You told us that she announced that change on the morning before she died. So now I'd like to focus your attention to that evening. Do you remember when Miss Lee went to bed on August 14th?
I think so. Yeah. We were watching NCIS until maybe 9:30, and then we went upstairs.
Did you see the defendant, Drew Mars, at all that evening?
Yes, sir. I was running downstairs to grab a drink, and I saw Drew go inside my grandma's room.
Did the defendant have anything with her?
Yes, sir. In her hand, I could see her holding something. It looked small.
Your Honor, at this time, we ask to read a portion of Exhibit 2 onto the record, if we may.
Is there any objections to that?
Without objection, Your Honor, excuse me.
Okay, we'll allow it.
The autopsy states, the sole and conclusive cause of the subject's death was a fatal allergic reaction to 2 chloroandramine pills, which caused her heart to stop beating. Thank you, Mr. Parts. Mr. Rogers, we just heard that 2 chloroandramine pills caused the death of Miss Lee. Do you know if Drew Mars had knowledge about that allergic reaction that Miss Lee would have to chloroandramine pills?
Yes, sir. She actually told me about it a week or two before she died.
Do you know if the defendant knew where they could find chloroandramine?
Yes, sir. Again, Miss Mars told me that she could get it from a pharmacy.
Mr. Rogers, are you aware of anyone who had chloroandramine pills in their possession?
Yes, sir. The police, they searched our house, and when they did, they found a bag with chloroandramine pills. It was inside Drew's closet. I was there when it happened.
Mr. Rogers, after you saw the defendant enter your grandmother's room, did you ever see your grandmother alive again?
No, I didn't.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Mr. Rogers, I want to start by talking about your life in 2008.
Okay.
Now, in 2008, you were a junior in college, right?
Yes, sir.
You had a good relationship with your grandmother, Agatha Lee, right?
Yes, sir.
The two of you communicated often, right?
Sure. As much as a normal grandson and grandchild would.
And the two of you saw each other fairly frequently, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in July of 2008, your parents, they passed away. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Yeah, they did.
And I want to clarify something. On direct examination, you said that was while you were in high school?
Maybe I misspoke. It was when I was younger. It's been a while, but yeah.
So, Mr. Rogers, you were a junior in college and your parents passed away in 2008, correct?
Yes.
And in July of 2008, when your parents passed away, you were left a trust fund, right?
Yes, sir.
There was $2 million in that trust fund.
Around that much, yes.
And a month later, in August of 2008, Miss Lee officially named you as the sole inheritor of her estate.
Yes, sir.
Now let's talk about what happened after Miss Lee named you as the sole inheritor. Now, in 2011, your relationship with Miss Lee had deteriorated, hadn't it?
Yes, it did.
The two of you weren't communicating as regularly.
We barely talked.
The two of you didn't see each other as frequently either, did you?
No, I didn't. I couldn't.
In fact, between 2011 and 2018, you didn't see Miss Lee in person once, did you?
No, we had a phone call or two, but that was it.
You had one phone call in those 7 years. Isn't that right, Mr. Rogers?
I think so. I called her. I believe she might have called once or twice, but I don't remember if I picked up.
Well, you know that Miss Lee had tried to reach out to you,
She wrote me letters, but I didn't write any back.
and you'd recognize a copy of one of those letters if I were to show it to you today.
Yes, sir. I think so.
Mr. Rogers, this is a copy of a letter that your grandmother sent you, right?
Yes, February.
It's a fair and accurate copy,
I think so. Yes.
and it hasn't been changed or altered in any way, has it?
No, sir. It doesn't look like it.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense moves to enter Exhibit 10 into evidence.
We object to hearsay.
Okay. Response.
Yes, Your Honor. Pursuant to 803.15, there are statements within this document that affect an interest in property. If I may proffer, this letter is the letter that Ms. Lee sent to Mr. Rogers, informing him that she was changing the plan for her, the execution of her will. Furthermore, Your Honor, pursuant to 803.3, there are statements in here that go towards Ms. Lee's mindset and her motivations for changing the will. So pursuant to 803.15 and 803.3, this Exhibit 10 is admissible.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor. For this to be 803.15, it doesn't describe the circumstances surrounding the exchange of that property. This isn't an official document. This isn't a will. This is a personal letter. This isn't a document where the intent of this document is exclusively to hand over or change any property in today's case. It's simply a personal letter. And as to the other exception that opposing counsel mentioned, the state of mind, there's statements in here which simply do not meet that exception.
May I respond on those grounds, Your Honor?
Yeah, and can you just remind me, you have 803.15 and 803.10? Is that the objection responses you have to the hearsay?
803.3 and 803.15, Your Honor, yes.
803.3, okay.
I believe 803.14 is what opposing counsel is referencing to in the discussion of wills and official documents that affect an interest in property. I believe 803.15 is for more informal documents, such as this letter, that do discuss an interest in property and that do discuss affecting an interest in property and changes in an interest in property, which is what is explicitly being covered in the fourth paragraph in this letter. Furthermore, Your Honor, if opposing counsel has problems with specific portions, I would only ask that they point them out so that I may better address the grounds of their objection.
And one second, what portion of this do you say would go through 803.3?
Yes, Your Honor. So directing your attention to the fourth paragraph, because we become family in name only, that's in reference to the previous two paragraphs that discuss reasons why they've become family in name only. As you could, if I could direct your attention to I believe it's the end of paragraph 2. I told you I'd cover all 3 years of law school and all the times you've called me asking for money. I've never said no. Furthermore, Your Honor, in paragraph 3, you never visit, and I don't hear from you for months at a stretch. And I don't even remember the time you called or wrote without asking for money. So, Your Honor, those are highlighting the reasons why, the intent, as well as the mindset behind Ms. Lee for changing the execution of her will.
Understood. A response?
Yes, Your Honor. Now, first and foremost, taking a look at the statements that opposing counsel just mentioned, they're not describing any intent of what Ms. Lee was going to do. She describes things that already happened. She's describing the fact that her grandson had never visited before, hadn't called, was treating her like her ATM. These are things that had already happened. And as such, they cannot go to her intent. They cannot go to what she was going to do because there are events that have happened in the past. 8033 doesn't apply. And as to the other exception that opposing counsel mentioned, if I can draw your attention to that exception under Rule 803.14 and 15, 803.15 says that it's a statement within a document that affects an interest in property. But first, we have to understand what a document of property is. And 803.14 lays out the prongs of what such a record may look like. It has to be a document that is kept in public office. It authorizes recorded documents of that kind inside that office. There's simply not enough foundation to show that this record under 803.14 is a record that affects an interest in property. And as such, no statements within it can be allowed under the following exception of 803.15.
Last word, Mr. Richardson.
Yes, Your Honor. 803.14 is in no ways any sort of gate in order for the 803.15 exception to kick in. 803.15 stands on its own. And as I said previously, 803.14 would apply to documents such as wills or things of that nature. But with the 803.15 exception, they are statements that are enclosed in a document, in this case, this letter, which do affect an interest in property. And going back to the 803.3 exception, Your Honor, it's not just a motive, intent, or plan, but it's also the mindset and the feeling of the individual who is speaking at the time. I've explained previously that pursuant to those parts of the exception, the statements enclosed in paragraphs 2 and 3 clear that bar. So at this point, Your Honor, the defense believes that paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 are admissible, as well as the entire document pursuant to 803.15 and 803.3.
May I respond, Your Honor?
No, I think we'll get this moving on, but well argued for both of you. I'll overrule the objection, but I'll only allow in paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. The rest will be redacted based on the arguments I've heard.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Mr. Rogers, I want you to look at this letter with me. Now, it was sent in February of 2018, correct?
Yes, February 1st.
And it was sent from Miss Lee to you, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, in this letter, Miss Lee explains that you don't visit her anymore, right?
Yes, sir.
That the only times that you call, if ever, you ask for money.
Yes, sir. That's what she said.
It says in the first sentence of the 4th paragraph there, we've become family in name only.
Objection, Your Honor. Cumulative. This is the 4th statement opposing counsel is just reading from this letter. The jury has this document. At this point, opposing counsel is cumulative under Rule 403.
May I respond, Your Honor?
I'll overrule the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Rogers, to be clear, the letter says we've become family in name only. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
Now, thank you, Mr. Baruki. You could take down this exhibit. Now, Mr. Rogers, because of all of these factors, Ms. Lee explains that she's changing the terms of her will, right?
Yes, sir. She did.
She was leaving everything to Drew Mars, right?
Correct.
Now, I want to be clear. In February of 2018, when you received this letter, well, you didn't rush to your grandmother's house to rekindle your relationship.
No, sir. I didn't.
Well, you also still had money left in the trust fund that your parents left. Isn't that right?
A little bit, sure. Yes.
But later on, in June of 2018, your trust fund ran out, right?
Not entirely.
In June of 2018, you had $12,000 left to your name. Isn't that right, Mr. Rogers?
Yes, 12,000.
And to be clear, in June of 2018, when you had these $12,000 left from your $2 million trust fund, that's when you sought out Miss Lee. Isn't that right?
Well, I guess I had 12,000 left, but it wasn't because I had 12,000 left. So I guess yes.
That's a yes. When you had the $12,000 left in June of 2018, you sought out Miss Lee, right?
Sure, yes.
Now, the first place you went to look to find Miss Lee, it wasn't Midlands where she was living, was it?
No, sir. I thought that she was at her old residence. I didn't know she had moved.
That's right. You had to hire an investigator to find your grandmother, right?
Yes. I couldn't just look online. She was too famous. Her address wouldn't be in a normal place that someone else's might be.
Mr. Rogers, you are her grandson, aren't you?
Yes, but as we talked about, I didn't have as good of a relationship with her, so I didn't know.
Now, you spent $10,000 to pay an investigator to find your grandmother. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
And the investigator told you that Miss Lee was now living in Midlands, right?
Yes, sir. I immediately went to her.
That's right. You showed up at Miss Lee's doorstep with your suitcases packed, didn't you?
Yes.
You planned on staying for a while?
I mean, I had what I had. Yes, I guess.
When you first came back to Miss Lee's life and you moved into her estate, you met Drew Mars for the first time.
Sure, I think so.
Now, you knew Miss Mars had been your grandmother's caretaker for a decade, right?
Yes, maybe 10 years.
You knew that your grandmother had told you that Drew Mars had stayed with her through thick and thin, right?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't talk that much, so we didn't really talk about Drew in maybe 6, 7, 8 years.
Mr. Baruchi, if you could pull back up that Exhibit 10 that we were just looking at. I want to be clear, Mr. Rogers, in that fourth paragraph, it says, your grandmother tells you that Drew Mars had stuck with you through thick and thin. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's what it says.
It says that Drew Mars had turned down several more lucrative offers to stay with Miss Lee, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Baruchi. You can take down the exhibit. I want to be clear about what's at stake for you today, Mr. Rogers. Now, you're suing Drew Mars under the Slayer statute. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
And you're familiar with how the Slayer statute works?
A little bit. I learned it for a little in law school, but I did drop out of law school.
Well, you do know that the Slayer statute says that an individual who kills another individual cannot inherit their estate, right?
Yes, sir.
So if the jury were to find in your favor today, that means you would become the inheritor of Miss Lee's estate.
Yes, sir.
That means you would inherit the Lee mansion where you'd been living.
Yes, sir. I get everything that was in the will.
That's right. I just have a few more questions. When your grandmother passed away, you rehired that same investigator that tracked down your grandmother. Isn't it right? Isn't that right?
Yes, I trusted him. I wanted a thorough investigation.
Well, it's true that you didn't trust the police to get that investigation right.
Yes, sir. That's why I hired Mr. Bond.
That's right. You hired Mr. Bond because you knew Mr. Bond would get that investigation right.
Yeah, Mr. Bond would get it accurate. I didn't trust the police to get it accurate.
You paid Mr. Bond $25,000 to get that investigation right, didn't you?
I believe that was the amount, yes.
And I want to be clear, Mr. Bond is now testifying on your behalf today.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
No redirect? Bar,
Thank you. Yes, yeah, redirect. Go ahead.
Your Honor, I said no redirect. If the
Oh, no
witness-
redirect?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, then we'll move on to the next witness. Thank you for your time.
May we call our next witness, Your Honor?
You may.
At this time, the plaintiff calls Max Bond to the stand. May we proceed?
You may.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury, sir?
Good afternoon. My name is Max Bond. I'm an investigative consultant.
What is that, sir?
Think Sherlock Holmes. I'm not a police officer, but They hire me when they hit a roadblock in a case. I do private investigative work for individuals too.
What sort of work are you referring to?
A lot of it is just tracking down missing spouses, but I also do more serious work like missing person cases and murder.
How long have you done this work, sir?
Decades. A while back, I got a degree in criminology. The plan was to become a lawyer, but I was more interested in investigations than with case books. So I got my private investigator's license and I've been working ever since.
Well, how did you become involved with this case in particular?
On August 15th, Stevie Rogers contacted me. He told me that he suspected his grandmother, the novelist Agatha Lee, had been murdered that morning.
Did you take the case?
I did. I made the drive to the Lee Manor right away.
What did you find when you got there?
When I arrived at the residence, I found Miss Lee in her bedroom. She was dead. When the police arrived, I led them to the body.
When the police arrived, did they take over that investigation?
No. Given my background and experience, they kept me on as a consultant. I became the point person for the investigation, and ultimately my conclusions led to Miss Mars's arrest.
You just said your conclusions led to the defendant's arrest. How do you go about forming them?
You might be familiar with the general method if you've ever seen an episode of CSI. In a potential murder case, we look for three things: motive, means, and opportunity.
Well, let's break each of those up, starting with motive. Does that mean anything unusual in the context of a police investigation?
No, sir. It means what you'd expect. Who has a reason to commit this crime?
Well, how do you go about investigating a potential motive?
Well, I started by conducting interviews. I interviewed Mr. Rogers and reviewed several emails on Miss Mars's computer.
All right, let's start with those emails. Mr. Garcia, could we get Exhibit 13 up on the screen? Sir, what is that?
This is that email I was just talking about, the one from Miss Mars's computer.
Does it look to be a fair and accurate copy?
Yes, sir.
And just to be clear, who wrote that email?
Miss Mars.
Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Without objection, Your Honor.
Okay, thanks. So answered.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, sir, what does Ms. Mars write in this email?
Agatha told me she changed her will to leave everything to me. I get everything. The house, the money, everything. This is going to totally change my life.
When you spoke with Mr. Rogers, did you ask him about that change?
I did.
Well, what did he say?
I learned that Miss Lee was planning on changing her will to remove Miss Mars. If that happened, Miss Mars would lose the estate, millions of dollars, all of it.
Sir, does losing millions of dollars count as a potential motive?
It's not rocket science, sir. Yes, it does.
Well, let's move on to means. What are means?
Means are the tools used to commit a crime. In this case, I had access to the gold standard, forensic evidence.
What sort of forensic evidence?
We received a toxicology report, lab testing results for fingerprints, and lab testing results for the chemical makeup of some pills.
Would you recognize that toxicology report if I showed it to you here today?
I would.
Mr. Garcia, could we get Exhibit 3? Thanks so much. Your Honor, this is one of those exhibits that has been previously admitted. Now, sir, what does this toxicology analysis say about how Ms. Lee died?
Miss Lee died of an allergic reaction to chloroandramine.
Did you find any chloroandramine in Ms. Lee's residence?
Yes. We discovered a bag in Miss Mars's closet during a search conducted on August 21st. Inside it, we found a bottle containing pills that looked like chloroandramine. We immediately sent the bag and the bottle to the lab so they could be tested.
What were the results of that lab's analysis on the bottle?
The pills were chloroandramine.
What about the bag?
Miss Mars's fingerprint was on the zipper.
Well, what did that mean for your investigation?
The drug that killed Miss Lee was found in a suspect's room with her fingerprints on it. That would be means.
So let's move on to that final part of your investigation, opportunity. Did you find that the defendant had an opportunity to poison Ms. Lee?
Yes. Drew Mars was responsible for filling Miss Lee's weekly pill organizer and had unrestricted access to her room.
Well, how does that pill organizer connect to opportunity?
It was Miss Mars's job to handle Miss Lee's medication. If Miss Lee would take the pills, according to which day was listed on her pill container. If Miss Mars put chloroandramine in there, Miss Lee could take them and die.
So, Mr. Garcia, can we get Exhibit 12 on the screen? Now, Mr. Bond, what is that that we put up there?
That's a photograph of the pill organizer we found in Miss Lee's room.
Does it look to be a fair and accurate depiction of that pill organizer?
Yes, it does.
Your Honor, we offer Exhibit 12 into evidence.
Without objection, Your Honor.
All right, so entered.
Now, if the wrong pills were put in her container, wouldn't that be obvious?
Actually, no. Chloroandramine is identical in appearance, size, and shape to the pills Miss Lee should have taken, an arthritis medication called Winterin.
Mr. Garcia, if we could zoom in on one of those boxes. Sir, do you know which of those pills are that Winterin arthritis medication?
Yes. We tested the remaining pills in the container, and actually, the pills in there that are Winterin are the two purple ones in the bottom left corner.
Did you find any evidence that on the day Ms. Lee died, the defendant replaced those pills with chloroandramine?
Yes, sir. A lab test revealed Miss Mars's fingerprints on exactly 2 of the arthritis pills in her bottle.
Thank you, sir. We pass the witness, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Mr. Bond, I want to backtrack to the beginning of your investigation. Now, you would agree with me that you were originally called and retained by the plaintiff in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers.
That's correct.
But to be clear, this isn't the first time that you've been retained by the plaintiff.
That's true. I was retained in July, I believe, to help Mr. Rogers find his grandmother.
That's right. And I kind of want to spend a moment and talk about the first time that the plaintiff retained you. Like you said, he was trying to find his grandmother.
Yes, sir.
And you accepted his work.
I did.
And fortunately for you, that job only took you less than 24 hours. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And so within 24 hours, you were able to give the plaintiff the exact address to where his grandmother lived.
That's correct.
And for your work, you got compensated, didn't you?
Yes, sir. Mr. Rogers paid me $10,000.
That's right. To be clear for the jury, the plaintiff paid you $10,000 for a job that took you less than 24 hours.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
I'd like to fast forward to the end of your investigation and talk about what you concluded happened on August 15th.
Sure.
Mr. Bond, you would agree with me that your first conclusion is that Agatha Lee's will would one day go to the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers.
Yes, if Miss Lee was going to change her will. That's right.
To the question as to improper opinion, may I be heard?
You may.
The witness is asking, or excuse me, opposing counsel is asking the witness to make a legal conclusion about what would happen if Ms. Lee died and someone was found to be responsible for that death. He's not qualified to make that opinion. He's an investigator.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This is the exact conclusion that Mr. Bond made on his direct examination when discussing potential motives for this case.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
On direct examination, he talked about what was currently stated within Ms. Marr's will. Now this is delving into a legal conclusion regarding statutory law regarding who inherits what, depending on the circumstances of a person's death. That is not within the scope of his knowledge.
Response to that? How is this within the scope of his ability to testify?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, as the private investigator, interviewed the plaintiff, and that is where he came to the conclusion that the will would one day be going to the plaintiff. This is something that this witness has already testified to on direct examination, and I'm asking him a question for clarification that that was in fact his testimony.
May I respond briefly, Your Honor?
Yes.
It's not my understanding that that was testified to on direct examination. If that's what opposing counsel is trying to establish, that foundation needs to be laid in those statements elicited.
Yeah, I have a little issue with him just stating where it's going, but I don't have an issue with if you go into the underlying facts that he may have that led him to that. Let's say he talked to somebody and that's where he got the information. I'm not okay with how the question is phrased as is, so I'll sustain the objection, but you can try other ways to get the answer you want.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, you'd agree with me that you interviewed the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers.
I did.
And in that interview, you uncovered that the plaintiff was going to have a will changed into his favor. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And to be clear, that will was originally going to be given to the defendant, Miss Drew Mars.
That's correct.
So to be clear, Mr. Bond, I want to talk about what information you used to come to that conclusion. Like we said earlier, you interviewed Mr. Stevie Rogers, the plaintiff.
I did.
Well, you never asked Miss Mars if that was her understanding of what was happening, did you?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Bond, you wouldn't know that, or whether or not Miss Mars had a slightly different interpretation of what happened during that conversation, would you?
I wouldn't know for sure, but I'm assuming that's why we're here today. They have different understandings.
Well, Mr. Bond, I want to talk about someone else who's pretty important to this case. You're familiar in your investigation with someone by the name of Mr. Ryan Cabrera?
I am familiar.
You're familiar with the fact that Mr. Cabrera is someone who was very close to the deceased Miss Agatha Lee, right?
That's not right.
Pardon me? You're familiar with the fact that Mr. Cabrera is someone who met with her every week?
Yeah, I know Mr. Cabrera was her biographer. I'm not exactly sure how close they are or what exactly they talk about.
Well, you never asked Mr. Cabrera if he had understandings about what happened on that conversation on August 14th either, right?
That's correct. It's my understanding that Mr. Cabrera wasn't actually present in the Lee Manor that day. That would be highly improper for me to ask him that. It would only be for him to relay a conversation he heard from multiple people.
So to be clear, that's a no. You never asked Mr. Cabrera about that conversation.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
In fact, you formed this conclusion after only talking with the person that hired you.
Right. Mr. Rogers told me that Miss Lee planned on changing her will.
Now, you also mentioned something on your direct examination that I found interesting. When you were first contacted by the plaintiff told you that Agatha Lee had been murdered.
That's correct.
Mr. Bond, to be clear, when the plaintiff contacted you, the police hadn't shown up yet?
That's correct. They showed up after I did.
When the plaintiff first contacted you saying it was murder, they hadn't done an autopsy?
That's correct. That was actually the day Miss Lee had died, so that would be odd if they had already performed an autopsy.
That's right. The plaintiff suspected murder before any investigation took place.
That's true.
I'd like to spend a moment and talk about how this could have happened.
Sure.
Mr. Bond, we can both agree that the person who is responsible for the death of Agatha Lee, that person would need to have access to her medication, right?
That's correct.
You would agree with me that Miss Agatha Lee, she has access to her own medication?
She does. That's correct, sir.
We can also both agree that the person who's responsible for the death of Miss Agatha Lee, well, she would have to have, or they would have to have knowledge of her allergy.
That's right.
We can both agree that Miss Agatha Lee also has knowledge of her allergy.
Sure.
We can also agree that the person responsible for their death, well, they'd have to have time alone without anyone seeing them. Isn't that right?
Time, that's correct. The switch out of pills could happen in seconds, though, so not very much.
Well, you'd agree with me that you spoke with Miss Drew Mars.
I did.
You were aware of the fact then from speaking with Miss Mars that Miss Agatha Lee spent a considerable amount of time that night by herself.
Hearsay.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This is not being used for the truth of the matter asserted, rather to show the subsequent actions or the subsequent investigation that took place from Mr. Bond, and whether or not he used this information when coming to his conclusions.
Your Honor, response?
Yeah.
They're using this to show the truth of the matter asserted, that Agatha Lee spent time alone, and during that time, she switched out pills for chloroandrami.
And he's getting this information from the defendant. Our response?
Yes, Your Honor. Like I said, this testimony is, if I may proffer, is going to come out in further witnesses when we intend to use it for the truth of the matter asserted. Rather, this specifically is just being used to show what information he did and did not consider or was made aware of in the course of his investigation.
Your Honor,
Okay. Yes, you may.
if it's going to come out during Ms. Marr's testimony, that's fine, and we can cross-examine her at that point. But for it to come out now is being used to reinforce that truth of the matter asserted, and it's not clear what subsequent investigation Mr. Bond is expected to have performed.
I think that's the purpose of the cross-examination. Also, since we don't have rebuttal witnesses here, I will allow him to ask it. I'll give the limiting instruction that should not be used for the truth of the matter asserted.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
So, Mr. Bond, to be clear, when you spoke with Ms. Mars, you found out that Miss Agatha Lee spent a considerable amount of time that night by herself.
That's true.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Miss Lee for a second. You were informed that Miss Agatha Lee, she looked rather lethargic that day.
Objection to lack of foundation.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This question started with you were informed that, insinuating that Mr. Bond either was or was not informed of this information. There's no lack of foundation here.
Response, Your Honor.
Yeah, can you tell us what you're getting at?
Yes, Your Honor. The foundation lies in hearsay, again from the defendant. They're using this to reiterate statements that will later be brought out by the defendant and to add to their veracity during this witness, and it's improper.
Can you remind me again what the statement is that we are objecting to?
That Ms. Lee was looking lethargic or tired in the days leading up to her death. And the only witness that will testify to that is the defendant. That's where he's getting this information.
Okay, your response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. It's the same. This is going straight towards what Mr. Bond did or did not use in coming to his conclusions, or what evidence that he ignored when coming to his conclusions.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yeah.
There's no evidence at all that Mr. Bond ignored ignored those Ms. Marr's statements. And opposing counsel simply can't elicit it because it's not true. They're using this to repeat this narrative that's been enforced from their opening statement about how Ms. Marrs was feeling sick or lethargic and then took her own life.
Well, yeah, last word from defense counsel.
Once again, Your Honor, it is the defense's contention that Mr. Bond incorrectly ruled out suicide as a potential cause of death. And this is evidence from Mr. Bond's investigation that he decided to not use or ignore when coming to those conclusions.
Again, we'll argue. I think I'll continue to allow this. Of course, feel free to raise your objection later on, but I will allow this in.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Bond, you agree with me that you were informed that Miss Agatha Lee was looking lethargic in the days leading up to her death?
Yes, the only person that's told me that was Miss Mars.
I want to talk. Excuse me. I would like to talk a little bit about something that you mentioned on your direct examination. You talked about some pills, didn't you?
Sure, Winterin and chloroandramine.
I want us to talk specifically about Winterin. We can both agree that Miss Drew Mars had fingerprints on that medication.
We can both agree to that.
We can both agree that that medication is a prescription medication for Miss Agatha Lee.
That's correct.
To be clear, Miss Mars is the person who handles her medication.
Yes, sir.
Miss Mars is the person who messes with pills and puts them into the pill container every night, right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. No further questions.
No redirect, Your Honor. At this time, we close our case in chief.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Bond.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break. Judges, please remember that this video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube live stream. I'll see you all again. 5 minutes. Let's start set a timer. We all have different time zones here, so it's the honor system. So see you guys in 5 minutes.
Your Honor, briefly, before we resume with the rest of the trial, I'd like to briefly re-raise my objection to those statements elicited because there was no follow-up questions about his subsequent investigation or lack thereof.
Yes. Okay. Was one thing I have to be clear. So you're
Can we please hold Judge Bombo until I've confirmed that we've got all judges back and ready to go before we handle this?
I apologize. Yes.
No, all good. With that though, if I could have all current scoring judges either turn their video on or message me to confirm that they are indeed back. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Sarah. I saw you. Thank you, Dion. Tegan, I've got you. Brad, I've got you. And Haley, do I have you? I might have missed you. Great. Thank you. Judge Wombo, you're good to go.
Thank you. So you're re-raising, Mr. Parch, you're re-raising your objection.
Yes.
To hearsay with the statements that was elicited during Mr. Bond's cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Was Mr. Bond? I believe you guys laid expert foundation for Mr. Bond. Is that correct?
That's not correct, Your Honor. He was simply an investigator who was providing. We didn't provide any 702 opinions.
Okay. Mr. I don't know if I can't say your last name. Boruki.
That's close enough. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, Your Honor. Like I said, this is going to show his lack of consideration for suicide as a potential cause, and that's something that the defense plans to bring up on closing arguments.
May I respond briefly, Your Honor?
Yes.
That was never cross-examined upon on Mr. Bond. If they had asked him, well, you never seriously considered suicide or talked about his investigation regarding the potential suicide, that would be perfectly admissible. That was never done.
Okay. Well, it's kind of too late to unring the bell at this point. Your point is well taken, but I will still allow the evidence in, and the jury can make up their mind about that.
Yes, Your Honor.
Again, not be taken for the truth of the matter asserted, but thank you for the objection. Overruled. And is the defense ready to call its first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Ms. Drew Mars to the stand. May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, my name is Drew Mars.
And Ms. Mars, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I come from a pretty big Indian family. My parents actually immigrated to the United States when I was young so that I could have better educational opportunities and a better life.
Well, what do you do for a living?
My family always wanted me to be a doctor, but I found that so impersonable. So I decided to go into nursing instead. And it was from nursing school that I actually became a living caretaker.
And who did you work for as a living caretaker?
Agatha Lee. She was my patient, but she became my family as well. Being so far from my grandparents, I came to see Agatha as a second grandmother.
And what kinds of things did you do for her as a living caretaker?
Well, when I started, Agatha was a really strong woman and she was prideful. She didn't need me to do much. My job was just to make her life a little easier. So I'd monitor her vitals, I'd help arrange her medications with her, and just all around, I made sure she stayed healthy and happy.
And around what time did you start working for Miss Lee?
It was when I was in college in 2008.
And now, are you familiar with the plaintiff in today's case, Mr. Stevie Rogers?
Yeah, he was Agatha Lee's grandson.
Were you aware of how Miss Agatha Lee felt towards the plaintiff at that time?
When I first started to work for Agatha, she wasn't really close to a lot of her family members. Stevie was probably the one member of her family she really bonded with. Their relationship changed later that year, however.
Did something happen?
Well, in 2008, Agatha's daughter passed away in a car accident, and Agatha was devastated. She went for weeks without speaking or really even leaving her bedroom. And then it was at that point that her only other family, Stevie, stopped talking to her entirely.
Did this affect Miss Lee at all?
Yeah, I think losing Stevie made her daughter's death that much worse. She seemed to get more and more withdrawn. She reached out to Stevie on many occasions, but from what I saw, he never really responded. I was really worried about her.
How did you know that she was devastated about losing contact with her grandson?
Well, she talked to me about it over dinner on many occasions. And she also showed me one letter she sent to him about their relationship after years of him not responding.
Would you recognize that letter if I were to show it to you?
Yes, I would.
Let the record reflect that I'm now showing Miss Mars what has already been entered into evidence as Exhibit 10. Miss Mars, what have I just showed you?
This is a copy of that letter she showed me.
And in this letter, did Agatha Lee ever talk about her feelings?
Yeah, you can see in the third paragraph, you're still treating grandma as your own personal ATM to fund whatever pops into your head next. You never visit. I don't hear from you for months at a stretch, and I don't even remember the last time you called or wrote without asking for money. I could tell she was really upset that the relationship had deteriorated this much.
Now, in terms of Miss Agatha Lee's mental health, did she ever seem to get better?
Well, she did seem to get a little bit better when Stevie reached out to her again. It was a few months after she sent that letter. He showed up and he asked to stay with her. She was really hopeful and I was elated. I was so happy to see her smile again. It didn't last long though.
What happened?
Well, as Stevie stayed at the house longer and longer, I could see Agatha was beginning to become worn down again. She seemed to be distancing herself. She was moving a lot slower. It was just like before Stevie returned to the house, and it got significantly worse on August 14th.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that day, Miss Mars.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what happened?
Well, I was on my way to bring Agatha tea, and I overheard a conversation between Agatha and Stevie regarding Agatha's will.
What did you hear?
Stevie said, I really hope you'd reconsider cutting me out of the will, but Agatha told him no, and I could tell she sounded really upset by that conversation.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay to Miss Agatha Lee's statements.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor. The statement no is specifically what she's referring to. And Your Honor, this testimony is being used directly to contradict a prior witness's testimony in which the plaintiff, Mr. Stevie Rogers, indicated that Agatha Lee said yes, where Miss Mars is recalling that the answer is no. This is the same conversation, and this information is being used to rebut a previous witness's testimony.
Response.
Sure, Your Honor. Now, if I may direct your attention to that rule under 801D1, a declarant witness's prior statement, for there to be an impeachment, as opposing counsel just stated, it has to be a statement that was given under the penalty of perjury at a trial, hearing, or other proceeding or deposition. We haven't heard about any such foundation, and because of that, this statement cannot be used for impeachment purposes because that foundation has not been laid.
You have a response to that?
Yes, Your Honor. Once again, here in court today, the plaintiff did assert that, in fact, Miss Agatha Lee did say she was going to change her will, and this is evidence that is refuting that.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
The Rule 801D1A explicitly states that the statement itself, which is being used to contradict, in this case, Miss Lee's statement, no, she had to have said that under oath at a trial, in a court proceeding, or in a deposition. This was in a room in her house with her grandson. There's been no foundation laid that this was at a trial, hearing, or any type of proceeding, that she was under oath, and as such, it simply cannot be used for impeachment purposes under that rule.
Your Honor, may I briefly?
Yeah, do you have
briefly
anything
respond?
about that specific concern about 801D?
D1, Your Honor.
A?
Yes, if I could direct your attention to 801D1, the top, before it even gets to the three prongs, the declarant testifies and is subject to cross-examination about a prior statement. Your Honor, it's not about the witness's current statement, but a statement.
And the statement is inconsistent with the declarant's testimony and was given under penalty of perjury at a trial hearing or other proceeding or in the deposition. So I understand this to mean the prior testimony was stated in a trial, deposition, or hearing. Is that not your understanding of the rule?
The defense stands by that is not correct, Your Honor.
Okay, I will sustain the objection.
Motion to strike any testimony if there was any elicited.
Right.
Now, I want to be clear, Miss Mars, when you heard them talking about the will, what day was that?
That was on August 14th.
And when did Miss Lee pass away?
It was that day, the 14th of August.
Now, how did Miss Lee act after that conversation?
Well, she was moving pretty slow around the house, and she seemed to be in really low spirits.
Well, how did she seem downtrodden to you?
Well, it all started when she told me she was going to lay down for a nap around 2 p.m. She usually only does that on really bad days. And so I came up 15 minutes later to see if she got settled and if she was all right, but she wasn't in her room. She was just standing outside my room, not moving. I was worried that maybe she was getting disoriented with all the changes I had been noticing in her behavior.
Did you see what she did afterwards?
Yeah, after standing outside my room for a bit, I watched her walk into her room and then she locked the door behind her.
Is it normal for her to lock her door?
No, almost never. And with how odd she was acting, I thought it was really worrisome that she locked the door in case she needed help.
Was this the last time that you saw Miss Lee?
No, it wasn't. Later that night, she came down and out of nowhere, she asked me to cook one of her favorite meals. It was fig and orange scones with clotted cream. She hadn't asked for that meal in over a year. I found it really odd.
Well, did you make that special request for her?
Yeah, of course. I figured maybe she just wanted something good to eat to make her feel better. But when I headed up to tell her dinner was ready, it seemed like there was more to it than that.
How so?
Well, when I came up, Agatha was just sitting up in bed, staring lifelessly at a wall. Her face was puffy, she was sniffling, and there was a box of tissues next to her bed. If I didn't know any better, I would have said she had been crying for a while. It was the saddest I had ever seen her.
Yeah. After you saw Miss Lee up in her room, what did you do?
Well, I gently offered that dinner was ready to see if maybe we could sit down and have dinner together. I'd known I'd been able to cheer her up in the past, but she said she wanted to have dinner in her study.
After you made her dinner, was that the last time that you saw Miss Lee?
Yeah, I guess that was the last time I saw Miss Lee alive.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the next day. Were you in the house at that time?
Yeah, I was actually the one to find her in bed that morning.
Can you tell us what happened?
I mean, I just went to check on her to see what she wanted for breakfast. And when I came in, she was lifeless. I couldn't believe she was gone.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
Cross-examination.
Yes, sir.
May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Miss Mars. My name is Raul Garcia, and I'm here to ask you some questions.
Of course, yeah.
I want to begin by talking about your relationship with Miss Lee.
Sure, yes.
Now, you began working with her all the way back in 2008, is that right?
Yeah, it was when I was still in school.
You lived with Miss Lee as her caretaker, is that right?
Yes, at first I was just part-time, and then she hired me on to be a full-time caretaker.
You lived with her for 10 years, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And after 10 years of living with her and spending time with her, she did something special for you, wouldn't you say?
Well, she did a lot for me that was really special. She treated me with the most respect. She paid me really well every year. She did my medical. I owe that woman so much. She was really kind to me when I worked with her.
Well, what she specifically did is she wrote you down as a sole inheritor on her will. Is that right?
Yeah, she did. And that was a lot. I couldn't believe she did that for me. It was really sweet and it was like so much.
Miss Mars, you understood this to mean that when she died, you would receive everything that she owned. Isn't that true?
That's what she told me, yeah.
And when you found out about this, well, ma'am, your family needed money. Isn't that true?
My family needed money, but I have enough money for my salary to pay them and in my savings currently. So I don't need money immediately at this moment.
Miss Mars, the question that I asked you is that your family needed money. Isn't that true?
Sure, but I was able to get them the money they needed each month.
Miss Mars, after 10 years of working with her, working for Miss Lee, you only had $20,000 in savings. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's a lot of money, especially from where my family comes from in India. It went a long way to whatever they needed, which was great. She paid me so much money. I couldn't believe it. She was really kind as an employer.
Well, then let's talk about what you stood to gain by staying on that will. Mr. Cooper, could you please pull up, or Mr. Parts, could you please pull up Exhibit 4? Miss Mars, you recognize that, don't you?
Yes, that's Agatha Lee's house.
If Miss Lee were to have died with your name on that will, you would get that house, right?
Yes, you're right.
You would get her car.
I guess so, yes.
An additional $20 million in cash. Isn't that true?
Yes, I believe so.
But if Miss Lee were to die without you on that will, you would only be left with $20,000. Isn't that true?
Yes, but that wasn't anything I ever worried about. 20,000 was a lot of money for me.
Miss Mars, the only question I asked you here today is that all you would be left with is $20,000, and that's a yes, right?
Yes, sir.
With all that money on the line, well, something changed in July. Isn't that true?
I don't understand what you're talking about.
In July, that's when her grandson, Stevie Rogers, came to visit, right?
Yeah, oh, you're right. That is when he came by. She was really happy to see him. It was great.
And when Stevie Rogers came to visit, well, you would see them spend some time together, right?
Yeah, initially they would go play backgammon together. They would go watch her programs. But it started to not make her as happy as I thought it would.
Miss Mars, I just want to be clear. While Stevie Rogers was there, you would describe her as happy. Is that right?
She was happier than she was before, that's for sure.
In fact, you would describe her as the happiest that you've seen her in the last 10 years that you lived with her. Isn't that true?
Yeah, initially she was so much happier.
So, Miss Mars, I want to now draw your attention to August.
Sure.
Now, by the time that August rolled around, you had seen them grow closer and closer together, right?
They did seem to get closer, but Agatha also started to kind of get worn down and deteriorate.
Objection, Your Honor. Motion to strike is non-responsive to my question.
Overruled.
Now, on August 14th, that's when you overheard a conversation about a will, right?
Yeah.
You overheard Miss Lee and Stevie Rogers talking about whether Miss Lee would be on that will, or whether Stevie Rogers would get put back on that will, right?
Yeah, I heard that conversation.
And after you heard that conversation, you heard her make a phone call. Is that right?
Yeah, I was driving her down to a meeting with Cabrera, and she made a phone call to Kirby Doolittle. That's what it is.
She made a phone call with someone who you believe to be her attorney. Isn't that true?
Yes, I don't know what the phone call was about.
Well, what you heard Miss Lee say is that she wanted to make an appointment for later that week. Is that right?
I believe so.
So, Miss Mars, earlier we heard today that it's possible that Miss Lee may have killed herself. Are you telling us here in court that she had in fact made plans for later that week?
I guess I don't know. I hope she didn't kill herself. It was my responsibility to make sure she was okay and happy.
Miss Mars, that wasn't what I asked you. What I asked you is whether or not it's true that she had in fact did make plans for later that week. And she did, right?
Yeah, she did.
So now I want to talk about Miss Lee's death. Now you're aware that she died because she took chloroandramine pills, right?
Yeah, that's what they told me.
The police, they found a bottle of chloroandramine pills inside your room. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I don't know how they got there. They told me there was a bottle in there. I know that Agatha stored things in my closet.
Miss Mars, I'm just here asking about what the police found in your room. Would you recognize a photograph of your closet?
Yes, I would.
Mr. Parts, could we please get Exhibit 14 up on the screen? Miss Mars, you recognize that, don't you?
Yeah, that's my closet.
That's a photograph of your closet from the last time you remember before Miss Lee died, right?
Yeah, no, you're right.
Now, if I'm looking at this picture correctly, there's a black bag in this picture, isn't there?
Yes, I never really noticed it, but I'm sure maybe it was in there.
Mr. Parts, if we could please zoom in on that black bag. That black bag, well, that's where the police found chloroandramine pills inside of it, right?
They told me they did. I don't know how it got there.
Well, not only did they find that black bag, they actually found your fingerprint on that black bag, didn't they?
Yeah, I was telling you, I must have moved it. I keep some of my stuff at the bottom of that closet, and so sometimes I'll move.
Miss Mars, the question that I asked you is whether or not it's true that the police found your fingerprint on that black bag. And they did, right?
That's what they told me.
Now, I want to talk about why that bag of pills was in your closet. Now, you were aware that Miss Lee, she had an allergy to chloroandramine pills, didn't you?
Yeah, I was actually brought on after she had accidentally taken some chloroandramine. It was a concern that the other caretaker had for Agatha.
You knew that chloroandramine could cause her to have a heart attack. Isn't that true?
Yes, and so we were careful to make sure people knew if they were going to be staying at the manor to not bring anything like that.
It was your job to handle her medication, wasn't it?
Yeah, at the beginning of each week, we'd sit down together and we'd put her pills in the organizer for the upcoming week.
And you're aware that the chloroandramine pills and the pills that she would take, they looked identical, didn't they?
That's what made them really dangerous, and that's why we were really careful not to keep any around the house at all.
Miss Mars, that's a yes to my question. They looked identical?
Yes, sir.
You knew where you could find chloroandramine, didn't you?
Apparently it's at any pharmacy because it's an over-the-counter drug.
So then let's talk about what you did after you heard Miss Lee call her lawyers. You went to a pharmacy, didn't you?
Well, I run errands whenever Agatha goes out for her meetings because it's my time of day to go and get her groceries. And so I ran to a CVS too to pick up some toiletries.
That's a yes to my question. You went to a pharmacy?
Yes, sir.
Now, you didn't see Miss Lee go to a pharmacy at any point that day, right?
No, not to my knowledge.
The only person that you're aware of who went to a pharmacy the day before she died is you, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, after you went to the pharmacy, you went back to Miss Lee's house, right?
I drove Miss Lee back, yeah, from her meeting.
And after you went back to her home, you went inside her room later that day, didn't you?
I don't remember what you're talking about.
You went inside her room at 6 p.m. on August 14th. Is that a yes or a no?
I believe so.
And Miss Mars, the day after you had gone to a pharmacy and went inside her room, she was found dead, wasn't she?
She was, yeah.
Thank you, Miss Mars. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Redirect.
Briefly, Your Honor. Miss Mars, do you remember being asked some questions about your closet?
Yeah, I do.
Would you recognize a picture of that closet if I were to show it to you?
Yes, I would.
Let the record reflect I'm showing Miss Mars what has already been entered into evidence as Exhibit 14. Miss Mars, do you remember telling us a few minutes ago that Miss Agatha Lee often stores things in your closet?
Yes, she does frequently. I try not to go and get into her things, so I'll just move them aside when I'm going through to get my stuff out.
Is there anything in this closet that was Miss Agatha Lee's and not yours?
A lot of it was Agatha Lee's. She used the whole top area and a lot of the bottom to just place her things.
Now, Miss Mars, I want to talk a little bit about something that opposing counsel just asked you about when you went into Agatha Lee's room.
Sure.
To be clear, Miss Mars, when you walked into Agatha Lee's room at 6 o'clock, was Miss Agatha Lee sitting in her bed?
Yeah, I was just checking on her. She was staring lifelessly at the wall. I was worried about her.
At any point on August 14th, did you ever walk into Agatha Lee's room when no one else was in there?
No, it was important that patients feel they have autonomy, so I wanted to give her as much space to do her own thing. I thought maybe it'd make her happier.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this point, I have no further questions.
Thank
Your
you.
Honor, I have no recross.
Okay. Is defense ready for its next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Mr. Ryan Cabrera. May I proceed?
You may.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, I'm Ryan Cabrera.
And what do you do for a living, Mr. Cabrera?
Well, I'm a biographer, a writer by trade. I've written profiles on all the biggest names, you know, from celebrities like A.J. McClellan to businessmen like Sawyer Shaw, even Governor Walton. Any story worth telling, I've told it.
And why are you here today?
Well, I was working on a profile of Agatha Lee, the famous mystery writer, for my next book back in 2018 when she unfortunately passed away.
What motivated you to do a profile on Agatha Lee?
Gosh, I mean, besides the fact that I was such a fan, she was this mysterious figure. She was a real life Jay Gatsby. I mean, she lived off alone with all her money. It was so weird that I just had to get her story of this reclusive woman who wrote such beautiful words. I reached out in 2015, but I didn't hear anything back.
And did you reach back out when Miss Lee didn't respond?
No, I generally figured that it was probably all that I was going to hear from her. But surprisingly, she hit me back up 3 years later. You know, apparently she was really a fan and I was approved to work on her biography.
Well, I want to talk about the very first interview that you conducted with Agatha Lee. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I was pretty nervous going in, which is a bit unusual, but as I said, I was a big fan. I went in to we met at her manor for our first meeting, and she was pretty friendly, which was nice. It was welcoming. Although I did, of course, learn that there was some ground rule. You know, I could ask any question except for one.
And which one question was off limits?
Well, I refer to it as the why question.
Mention, Your Honor, as to lack of foundation.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, of course. I just want to clarify whether or not these are Ms. Lee's statements or if he discerned this information about what was and was not off limits in some other way.
Can you clarify for us, Mr. Richardson?
Yes, Your Honor. The line of questioning is about Mr. Cabrera's first interview, and so it came from a conversation that Mr. Cabrera had with Ms. Lee at this initial interview.
Does that satisfy you, Mr. Parks?
Yes, Your Honor. If we could just lay that foundation for the jury so it's clear that that was how he learned that information.
Is that okay with you, Mr. Richardson?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's lay that foundation.
Mr. Cabrera, when did you learn about this off-limits question?
It was actually the first thing Agatha ever told me. She looked me in the eye and she said, "You can ask me anything except for one."
And what question was that?
Well, as I was saying, I call it the why question. She never wrote another book after Death in a Bottle, her bestseller. And she did not want me to ask why, apparently.
How long had you been working on Agatha Lee's profile when she passed?
Well, not long by my standards. I generally take at least a full year before coming up with the first draft, but I began working with Agatha in February of 2018, and then she passed away in August. So those 6 months I was working with her, but the work was a little more intense than my usual work.
How so?
Well, we met more frequently, given that I was also in Midlands to do these interviews. We met multiple times a week for those 6 months. It was constant, not just the interviews, but research, following. I really lived and breathed Agatha Lee. I mean, I honestly don't know if anyone spent as much time one-on-one with her as I did in those times.
Did Miss Lee ever discuss her family with you?
Yes, at first it took some prying, but it really was the crux of the book, so I needed to get it out. And she did lose her daughter in a traumatic incident, so she didn't like to talk about it at first, but that was the keystone in her narrative. She really went into isolation after that happened. That's when she really kind of started to draw inward. And then until her grandson showed back up, then she became a little more extroverted once more.
And when did her grandson show up back into her life?
That would have been in July, after I'd been working with her for a while. She had been pretty down, and then one day I came by and
Objection, just speculation, Your Honor. As to Agatha Lee's mood over the course of an extended period of time.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Cabrera said that Miss Lee appeared down based off on the conversations that he conducted with Miss Lee. That's exactly where this information is coming from. It's not outside of Mr. Cabrera's ability to explain what Agatha Lee's mood was during these interviews.
Response to that?
I withdraw the objection, Your Honor. That's fine with us.
Okay. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Cabrera, I want to move on and flash forward to your last meeting with Miss Lee. And when was the last time that the two of you interviewed?
Oh, that was the day she died, actually August 14th. It was the best of interviews, the worst of interviews, sadly.
And where did the two of you meet for this interview on August 14th?
Just down by the courthouse, had a restaurant near there. I know the owner. They started with a soup truck and worked their way up. It's another story I've told in one of my books that's in stores now.
And how did that meeting begin?
Well, structurally, it was the same as all others. She showed up, and then we got the tape recorder out and started talking. But Agatha was very different. She was much quieter than usual, just looked very tired, withdrawn. It was very hard to get that same lively Agatha that had come up in some of my earlier interviews.
You said this livelier Agatha from your earlier interviews. Was this behavior unusual?
It wasn't unusual for Agatha to be a bit withdrawn some days and to seem kind of upset. We also talked about some intense things like the loss of her daughter. So these were emotional meetings much of the time, but I had never seen her come into a meeting just so out of sorts,
And did you ask Miss Lee what was the matter?
Of course, I asked her everything. That's my job. I mean, I had to know it all.
And what did Miss Lee tell you?
She just said that, she was going to have to turn down her grandson, Steve.
Objection, Your Honor. It's hearsay.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor. The statement Mr. Cabrera is eliciting is that she was planning on or intended to turn down her grandson. And pursuant to 8033, that would fall under the exception as the declarant's intent or plan.
May I respond, Your Honor?
May.
That statement isn't relevant unless it's clear what she's discussing about what she's going to turn Stevie Rogers down about. And it's our good faith belief that the defense is trying to elicit this statement because Ms. Rogers prior made a statement that Stevie had asked for something earlier during that interview. So unless that statement is elicited, which it can't be because it's hearsay, this lacks foundation, it's irrelevant.
Boss.
Yes, Your Honor. responding to opposing counsel's new relevance objection, Mr. Cabrera is explaining how Agatha Lee's attitude and demeanor was different on this August 14th interview. Therefore, this exclamation from Miss Lee on August 14th points to how different that Miss Lee's demeanor was at that interview. And therefore, because of that fact, it is relevant. Going back to the 8033 response, Your Honor, there is no bar that the statement must be tied to some other piece of evidence or some other statement that needs to be made. It's just a statement of an intent or a plan. And Mr. Cabrera explained that Agatha Lee told her that she was planning or intending to turn down her grandson, and therefore is admissible under 8033.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
The specific statement was that she was going to have to turn Stevie Rogers down. Now, a crucial point in this case is whether or not Ms. Agatha Lee was intending on changing her will at Mr. Rogers' behest. They're clearly using that to elicit some sort of opinion as to whether or not Ms. Lee was planning on doing that exact thing in it, and they need to lay that foundation, which they can't because it's hearsay.
Your Honor,
yes, go ahead.
Your Honor, that simply goes to the weight of the evidence that the jury places on it, not its admissibility. Opposing counsel is free to cross-examine Mr. Cabrera in a few moments on this fact. As for the statement, it is admissible under 8033.
Mr. President, I have a question as to, you're saying that this is not relevant because they don't have the first part as to what she means by turning him down. Am I correct in understanding?
Yes, Your Honor.
Well, there's been testimony throughout trial that there was a question about whether or not she agreed to change her will or not agreed to change her will. What's wrong with the jury taking this piece of evidence and working it with what we've heard in trial today? What's wrong with that?
Because it's a fragment of a conversation that's taken out of context. We've heard that Mr. Cabrera and Ms. Lee had numerous interviews in which they discussed her family history and numerous developments and events in her personal life. And to use this out of context statement that she was planning on turning Stevie down, it lacks foundation, and it goes to show the jury a conclusion that we believe is inadmissible.
Last word to you, Mr. Richards.
Yes, Your Honor, we stand by the fact that this statement is not a fragment. This is the statement that Ms. Lee elicited under 80 and is admissible under 8033. Furthermore, Your Honor, if opposing counsel believes this is irrelevant, then we are here for that very reason why opposing counsel believes this is irrelevant. As this issue of whether or not Ms. Lee was going to change her will is the crux of this case today, it is entirely relevant for the jury to hear. And this statement, and that would go towards its weight that the jury places on it rather than its admissibility.
Yeah, I tend to think there's enough circumstantial evidence that this conversation might be related to it. As it was on August 14th, we've heard back and forth. It seems to be something that the jury can determine. And of course, you're more than welcome to attack it on cross-examination. And I believe you're the closer, so you know. So,
yes, Your Honor.
So overruled.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Cabrera, you were telling us about something that Agatha had told you at your meeting on August 14th. Could you just say it again for the jury, please, and continue?
Yes, she had mentioned she was going to have to turn Stevie down.
Did Miss Lee tell you anything else?
The only other thing she really said, I kind of was trying to keep the interview going. I wanted to talk about Stevie, but she just said, I just want forgiveness for what I have to do.
Now, did you follow up on any of this mystery that Agatha Lee was talking about?
I tried, but...
Actually, the attorney testifying regarding this characterization of mystery.
Can you please rephrase your question?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Cabrera, did you follow up on any of this that Miss Lee was telling you about?
Well, I tried to follow up on everything in our interviews, but she just reached in her bag and pulled out a cigarette and started smoking. And I knew that meant she wasn't talking anymore.
Tell us, how did the rest of that interview go, Mr. Cabrera?
As I said, it was a bit difficult because she didn't feel the need to talk much more, and she was still very withdrawn. She was just kind of staring off for most of it. But I could really sense that there was something that she needed to tell me. It was what was going to make this book really pop, because the way she looked at me, she just there's just a connection between authors, I guess. Perhaps I'm not articulating it that well, but I decided to push a little more and get to the big question.
Walk us through how that meeting ended with the big question.
Well, originally I stood up acting like I was going to leave, and part of me was prepared to, but I feel like it was truly going to be that moment where she stopped me. And sure enough, she didn't move. She just sat there. And then I saw a tear roll down her eye, and she asked, "Is there anything else you want to ask?" So I asked the last question, the only one that I hadn't asked, the only one I hadn't been able to.
And what question was that?
The question of why she never wrote another book.
Was this the first time that you asked Miss Lee that why question?
No, but it was the first time that she had brought it up, and it was the first time that I actually got an answer.
What did Miss Lee tell you when you asked the why question?
Oh, she entrusted me with some great knowledge that Agatha Lee is the greatest American novelist since Hemingway. She had a dozen unpublished manuscripts just sitting at her home. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that she had never told anyone this. I couldn't believe that she was telling me now. It really felt like such a reward at the time. Now it feels far less fulfilling.
Mr. Cabrera, did you see Agatha Lee again after this interview?
No, I didn't. That was the last interview I had with her. She passed away the next day. It was very hard hearing that, especially looking back on how our interview had gone.
What do you mean?
Well, I left the interview very excited, obviously, about this new news, but I was also worried about her. I had never seen her that upset, and it felt very odd to me that she allowed me to ask that question she'd been so adamant on keeping secret. People don't just give secrets away, you know. I learned that through my book with Jordan Ryder, but it really set me on uneasy trend. So I tried calling the next day, but I couldn't get her.
Mr. Cabrera, when did you find out that Agatha Lee had passed away?
That next day, Drew Mars, her caretaker, called me sobbing. I could hardly understand what she was saying, but I learned that Agatha had gone in her sleep.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrera. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Permission to proceed?
You may.
Now, Mr. Cabrera, I'd like to start with where you left off with those unpublished novels, okay?
Yes, certainly.
Now, you talked a lot about your interview with Ms. Lee, right, on that last day?
Yes.
You talked about how she looked tired.
Not just tired, but worn down.
Exactly. She looked withdrawn. You're telling us that, right?
Yes, she was very withdrawn, very quiet, very somber.
There was just something different about her that last day, right?
Yes, I had seen her upset before, withdrawn before, but never on this level.
Well, sir, I'd like to talk about what you stand to gain if the defense wins this trial, okay?
Sure, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but very well.
Well, you actually talked to the defendant before you came here to testify, right?
A while back, I believe, yes, when I first heard about the civil case.
The defendant asked you to testify in this trial, and you had a request of your own, right?
Yeah, Drew Mars reached out and asked if I could testify, given my relationship with Agatha. And then I also asked, you know, if there was anything from Agatha's estate that I could have to remember her by and to make sure the world remembered her.
And specifically, you asked for Ms. Agatha Lee's library, right?
Yes, for those unpublished manuscripts. I thought that was the best way to make sure her legacy continued to live on.
Well, sir, let's talk about how much those unpublished manuscripts might be worth, okay?
Okay, sure.
Like you talked about, Ms. Agatha Lee, she's America's most famous mystery author, right?
I believe so. I don't know how we measure famousness, but I would say she's easily the most skilled, and she's certainly very well regarded.
She sold millions of copies of that one book she's published.
Yes, death in a bottle.
She's made millions of dollars off of that book.
Yes, rightfully so. It's a masterful work.
And Mr. Cabrera, if the defense wins this trial, you get those 12 unpublished novels, right?
Yes, so I can take them to my publisher and let them be seen for the world.
You get the rights to those 12 unpublished novels. Isn't that right, sir?
No, that's not how publishing works. I don't get the rights. The author retains the rights. It would go to Agatha's estate. I can't claim credit for her work.
All right, sir. Well, I'd like to move on to something else you mentioned. You said you met with Ms. Agatha Lee, and you said you met with her a few times a week, right?
Usually, yes.
Now, that meeting was on August 14th, right?
That last meeting, yes.
And she actually mentioned that she had another meeting coming up soon, right?
Yes, she had an appointment. We were trying to schedule, and she said that there was something.
You were trying to schedule another interview for that Friday.
Yes.
Ms. Lee, she said that she couldn't make that meeting, right?
Yes, she kind of waved her hand and said, I'm meeting with attorneys then. You know, she was very dismissive sometimes when she didn't want to get down to the nitty gritty.
She didn't just say that. She said that she was meeting with her personal attorney. Isn't that right?
I believe so. I know it was an attorney that was mentioned.
Mr. Cabrera, is that a yes or a no? She said she was meeting with her personal attorney.
I'd say yes. I'd assume so, probably.
The same attorney who handles her estate. Isn't that right, sir?
I'm not sure. I know the attorney who handled her estate, I saw the will reading, but I don't know if it was the same one.
All right, sir. Now, you'd agree that Friday, that was after Wednesday, right?
Yes, chronologically, that's usually the case.
Of course, sir. Now, Friday, that's after the day that Ms. Lee was found dead.
Yes, unfortunately.
So Ms. Lee had plans to meet with her attorney after the day she was found dead. Isn't that right, sir?
That's what she told me. I don't know how solid the plans were.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about that estate. Did you attend the will reading, sir?
Yes, mostly for research purposes. At that time, I thought I was still going to be working on the book, but I later shifted gears. It just felt in bad taste to continue writing.
Now, the defendant, Ms. Mars, she was there too, right?
Yes, she was present.
You found Ms. Mars' behavior at that will reading to be a little strange, wouldn't you say?
Yes, I thought everybody acted a little strange. I was kind of confused. You know, I thought this was going to be a serious event, but you had Stevie on one hand, silent and pouting, and then you had Drew Mars acting so surprised for some reason.
Mr. Cabrera, back to my question. You thought that the defendant in particular was acting pretty unusual, wouldn't you say?
Yes, as I said, she was surprised, which I thought was weird.
And not only was she surprised, she kept repeating the words, "I can't believe it. I had no idea," after Ms. Lee's will was read, right?
Yeah, she was saying that, and Stevie was kind of glaring at her, and the detective was somewhere, and that crackpot Bond was giving some pronouncement. It was a circus of an affair, to be quite honest.
Mr. Cabrera, I understand, but I'm just looking for a yes or a no. Did she say those words?
Yes, she said those words.
That was strange to you because you knew that the defendant knew about her inheritance. Isn't that right?
I was pretty certain. She'd been in the room when we were talking about it. I mean, she didn't say anything, but I figured she had to have heard it.
Exactly. You had been in a room with Ms. Mars and Ms. Lee when Ms. Lee had explicitly said that the defendant was going to inherit her estate.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, though, I don't know if Drew heard. She had her AirPods in, and she was kind of like getting the pills ready, but I imagine she had to. Agatha was not a quiet woman most of the time.
She was handling the pills, but that was a yes, right, sir?
She was in the room, yes.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. So we will now, there's no more witnesses from the defense, is there?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. So now we are going to move into closing arguments from each party. So we should please switch to the speaker view.
And Your Honor, it's our understanding that we for time purposes, we need to proceed straight into closing arguments rather than taking a break.
Yeah, they gave us a script and I don't see a break here after before closing.
Okay,
so
gotcha. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right. So whenever the plaintiff is ready, proceed. Is there a rebuttal time in this format?
Yes, there is.
Okay. All right, you may proceed.
Of course. May I proceed, Your Honor?
You may.
May it please the court. Counsel for the defense. Members of the jury. We have been in court here today for one reason: to determine whether the defendant, Drew Mars, murdered Agatha Lee. You see, on August 14th, Ms. Lee went to go to bed. She had just spent an evening with her only grandson. She felt safe. But what Ms. Lee didn't know was that she had been poisoned by the defendant, Drew Mars, the woman whose job was to protect Ms. Lee. You see, the evidence has shown that the defendant, Ms. Lee's caretaker, knew she was going to get cut out of Ms. Lee's will. Her time was running out, and so she made a choice. A selfish and senseless choice to poison Ms. Lee through her own medication. And members of the jury, throughout today's trial, we have seen that the defendant laid a trap, but she left a trail of evidence. From the pharmacy to the defendant's closet and straight back to the defendant. See, in this trial, it was our job as the plaintiff to prove to you that the defendant killed Ms. Lee. We have brought suit against Ms. Mars under what's called the Slayer statute. Now, the judge just told you before closing arguments that law says something that's pretty common sense. If you kill another person, you don't get to inherit anything from them. We had to prove to you that the defendant killed Ms. Lee by a preponderance of the evidence. This means that if you find it just a hair more likely than not that the defendant killed Ms. Lee, the law requires that you find in favor of the plaintiff. And the evidence in this case has shown that the defendant had access, she had a motive, and all the forensic evidence in this case points straight back to her. It was the defendant who laid a trap to kill Ms. Lee, but left a trail of evidence. You see, back in 2018, the defendant had been working as a caretaker for Ms. Lee for 10 years, one of America's most famous authors, and she had a fortune to match. Ms. Lee had one family member remaining, Mr. Rogers, and feeling that they'd grown apart, she names Ms. Mars her caretaker as inheritor of her estate. Ms. Mars' work, it had paid off. A woman who prior had just $20,000 in savings, urgently in need of cash, would now soon have tens of millions of dollars to her name, all by the stroke of Ms. Lee's pen. But then, members of the jury, something changed. Mr. Garcia, can we get that timeline up on the screen, if possible? You see, on July 4th, Mr. Rogers came to visit his grandma. When her grandson returned, it was now Mr. Rogers who spent time with Ms. Lee. They shared meals, watched movies, talked about their plans for the future, and that renewed connection was strong. Over the course of that month and a half, they grew closer and closer, and Ms. Mars herself told you it was the happiest she'd seen Ms. Lee in 10 years. But Ms. Lee's happiness, it came at a price for the defendant. Because she knew that the closer Ms. Lee got to Mr. Rogers, the more likely it was that her assets would go to Mr. Rogers and not to the defendant. Now, on August 14th, those suspicions, they proved true. By all accounts, members of the jury, the defendant listened in on a conversation between Mr. Rogers and Ms. Lee. And now we have heard that Mr. Rogers and Ms. Mars have diverging accounts of that conversation. Mr. Rogers says that Ms. Lee said that she would write Mr. Rogers back into the will, and Ms. Mars says the opposite. That conversation, members of the jury, is important. We know that one person heard what was said, the defendant, and hatched a plan to murder Ms. Lee. And all the evidence points to that conclusion. Let's first talk about knowledge. You heard that Ms. Lee had a fatal allergy to a drug called chloroandramine. And we know that both Mr. Rogers and Ms. Mars knew about that allergy. But you heard that the crime took a lot more than knowing Ms. Lee had an allergy. Like the defense talked about in their opening statement, that poison wasn't dissolved in a beverage or delivered to her without her knowledge. The killer put it in her own hands. The killer in this case knew that Ms. Lee's arthritis medication had exactly the same size, shape, and appearance as her daily arthritis medication, and that's exactly what the defendant knew. It was the defendant, and only the defendant, who set a trap to kill Ms. Lee. And that's exactly what the forensic evidence has shown. Ms. Mars' fingerprints were on a bag containing those poisonous chloroandramine pills in her closet. And what's more, exactly 2 of those pills, the same number as Ms. Lee's daily dose of arthritis medication, were found with Ms. Mars' fingerprints. You see, this case, it's straightforward. Ms. Lee had grown close to her grandson, and at the end of her life, she wanted to leave her belongings to her only remaining family member. That was her wish. But Ms. Mars, the defendant, she wanted that money. And if she couldn't get it, Ms. Lee had to go. And yet, at the beginning of this trial, Mr. Richardson has the audacity to tell you that this case is about Ms. Lee wanting to write the ending to her own story. Members of the jury, the truth is, because of the defendant, Ms. Lee didn't get to. She wanted to live out the rest of her life with her family and to leave her belongings to her only grandson, and because of the defendant, she didn't get to write that final chapter to her story because she was murdered. Members of the jury, Ms. Lee, she trusted Ms. Mars. She couldn't imagine that someone who she lived with for 10 years would do what Ms. Mars did. Would abuse that trust and see Ms. Lee's life or death as a piggy bank to be played with. But she left a trail of evidence. She lied at the will reading. She left her fingerprints at the crime scene. And she tried to take Ms. Lee's last wishes into her own hands. But members of the jury, today you can give the dignity of having her wishes respected back to Ms. Lee. We ask that you do justice in this case and find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Parts, is the defense ready to proceed with closing statements?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may proceed.
Miss Agatha Lee wanted to write the end of her own story. And in order to tell you about that story, I want to backtrack. I want to talk about something that the plaintiff failed to mention, because the plaintiff wants you to believe that this story started on August 14th. They wanted you to believe that this conversation or this story started when the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers, and Agatha Lee agreed to have their will changed. But unfortunately, the plaintiff forgot to tell you that this story starts back in 2008. And it's a story of mental health. We learned today that at the beginning of 2008, Miss Agatha Lee was happy. She was close with her daughter, and she was close with her grandson. Unfortunately, this didn't last long, as in 2008, Miss Agatha Lee's daughter died in a car accident. And we knew how that affected Miss Lee. She became sad, downtrodden, depressed. And unfortunately, that was compounded by the fact that her one last relative, the plaintiff, also completely cut contact with her. Now, this didn't last forever because the plaintiff eventually came back. Unfortunately, what we learned was that the plaintiff only came back for one reason. It's because the plaintiff ran out of money. And the plaintiff knew that Agatha Lee would accept her grandson with open arms, and he made every attempt to make that happen. He called up Detective Bond, paid him $10,000, and was able to get back in contact with Agatha. Unfortunately, as we found out, Miss Lee figured that out. Shortly after moving in, Miss Lee was back to her old self. The self that happened after she lost her entire family. And this was compounded by a conversation that took place on August 14th. A conversation about Miss Agatha Lee's will, where the plaintiff asked Miss Agatha Lee to change it. And as Mr. Part said on his closing argument, it's exactly right. The plaintiff said that Agatha Lee agreed to change it. But Miss Mars heard a different conversation. And so I ask you to look at who else was familiar with a conversation on August 14th. You learned today through the testimony of Mr. Ryan Cabrera that Agatha Lee turned him down. Unfortunately for Mr. Bond and the rest of the investigation, they never asked those questions. They never sucked out the answer, and they ignored the truth. But after the plaintiff asked to change his will, well, we know how Agatha Lee responded. We learned today that Miss Lee became even more sad, that she started moving around the house slowly, and then she started to act different. She decided that she wanted to take a nap at a time where she never did. She locked the door behind her, which is something that she didn't do either. She asked for a special meal that night, a meal that she hadn't asked for in over a year, and a meal that she never asked for dinner. The plaintiff decided to ignore those odd behaviors. Unfortunately, they also ignored what happened afterwards. Miss Mars walked into Miss Agatha Lee's room to bring her dinner. And what did she see? She saw a sad woman who was sitting on her bed, blankly staring into a wall. Her nose was swelled. She was sniffling. She had a box of tissues next to her. Members of the jury, the plaintiff wants you to forget how Miss Lee was acting. Miss Lee, at that point in time, members of the jury, was ready to write the end of her own story. And unfortunately, we didn't talk much about this story. But fortunately for you, when you go into trial to deliberate, you'll get a summary of Miss Agatha Lee's one and only book. And it's a book about an aging millionaire who died to a very specific allergy. An allergy to chloroandramine. Members of the jury, Miss Agatha Lee wrote this book about herself because she, in fact, also is a rich millionaire who has a chloroandramine allergy. And that's why on the last day, you heard from Mr. Ryan Cabrera. You learned that in one of the last meetings that Miss Agatha Lee had, she surprised everybody and told them that she had dozens of unpublished works that she never released. That was the one question that she refused to answer. But she did on August 14th. I want to talk a little bit about how this happened and why the plaintiff's idea of what happened isn't correct. Well, we know that someone needs to have access to her medication, and Miss Lee does. We know that someone needs to have knowledge of her allergy, and Miss Lee also has knowledge of her allergy. But what's really important is someone needed to have time alone in Agatha Lee's room to switch those pills. Now, the plaintiff, they tried to tell you that it was Drew Mars who went into the room at 6 p.m. to switch her medication for lethal chloroandramine pills. But when Miss Mars entered into the room, Agatha Lee was there. In fact, the plaintiff brought you no evidence that suggested that at any point in time, Miss Drew Mars ever walked into that room alone. They tried to tell you that since the bag of pills were found inside of Miss Mars's closet, then they must have been hers. But members of the jury, we learned that that's not necessarily true either. Because Miss Agatha Lee also used that closet to store many things. And in fact, when you look at that picture, what you'll find is that most of the things that were stored there were not of Miss Drew Mars. Unfortunately, what happened on August 14th was a tragedy. It's unfortunate, and there's really nothing much that we can do about it. But what we can do is not take an innocent housekeeper and charge her for the murder that she did not commit. And that's why I stand before you one last time, and I ask that you find her not liable. Thank you.
Brief rebuttal, Your Honor.
Go ahead.
Members of the jury, where's the evidence? They're talking about Ms. Lee's suicide. Where's the suicide note? Where's a history of mental health, depression, anxiety? None of it's there. Where are her fingerprints on the bottle? None of that is there, members of the jury, because it's not true. And the fact is that the case they brought before you today rests on a liar. Someone who lied to the police about knowing about her inheritance because she thought she could throw them off her trail. She's the only person who testifies about this bizarre last meal. She's the only person who testifies about Ms. Lee's deteriorating health condition. None of that is true, members of the jury. All we ask is that you don't let a guilty woman profit off a mental health crisis by fabricating a story about suicide. Just don't fall for that. Find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to go ahead and end the live stream.